Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue à ce webinaire portant sur les réseaux de gouvernance complexe avec comme invité notre collègue et chercheur invité au Centre d'études en gouvernance, le professeur Goktuk Morkel. Hello everyone, my name is Rick Champagne. I'm a professor at the School of Political Studies and the director of the Center on Governance at the University of Ottawa. It's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you for this presentation by Dr. Goktuk Morkel on complex governance networks, where he will be presenting a conceptual framework for public policy and administration in the 21st century. But before we start, I would like to pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Now, I would like to introduce our guest speaker for today. Dr. Morkel is a professor of public policy and administration at Penn State University at Harrisburg, and he is currently a visiting professor and a Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Governance and Public Administration at the Center on Governance. He has co-authored or authored and edited at least 8 books, and he published paper in major academic journals in public administrations. Several of his books and papers are addressing complexity theory in public administration. He served for many years as the chair of the section on complexity and network studies at the American Society for Public Administration. He also served as the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Complexity, Governance, and Network Journal. I invite you to have a look at this publication and at this very journal that I just named, who he has contributed to create. Today, Dr. Morkel will share a preview of his forthcoming book entitled Complex Governance Networks, Foundational Concepts and Practical Implication, which will be published by Routledge in the upcoming months. Dr. Morkel will take around 40 minutes to present his ideas on the subject, and he will then take some questions. I just want to remind everybody that you can post your questions at any time during and after the presentation by using the Q&A button you will find at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to our colleague Goktuk for his presentation. And after his presentation, I'll moderate the Q&A period. Goktuk?
Well, thank you, Eric. Thank you so much for this introduction, and also more importantly, for inviting me to make this presentation and actually hosting me here at the University of Ottawa in this beautiful city of Ottawa. Spring is beautiful here, so I am told. I'm expecting it to arrive anytime soon, but seriously, it is a beautiful city, and I truly appreciate being here. I also want to thank Anna, Mahyar, and Mike for setting up this event. There's quite a bit of technical work behind it, as everybody can imagine. And I want to also thank all the attendees. And I understand there are some students and faculty members from the University of Ottawa. And there are some of my colleagues from Penn State and students as well. And there are many others whom I don't know. And there are also family members in the audience. So I want to thank you all. Now, let me begin by sharing my screen. And here we are. Well, this presentation is about my forthcoming book, as Eric mentioned, but I will not necessarily talk about all aspects of the book because we have limited time. And to make it a little bit more interesting, perhaps, I will focus on some issues that I do not talk about in the book. So essentially, this is an outline of my presentation, but the items that I highlighted there are the ones that I'm going to talk about a little bit more extensively. And I'll be happy to answer questions about any of these and what is in the book. What are the questions that I'm trying to answer in the book? Actually, I'm not going to answer all these questions in the book, but these are the questions that motivated me writing the book. The big question is, how do human societies solve their collective problems? How did they do that throughout history? And so how can we bring those experiences to the early 21st century? That brought me to complex governance networks, and I'll tell you about that. Within that, of course, there are some series of questions. And there, for example, what are the institutional forms, organizational forms that humans created and how they evolved? And particularly, what were and what are the roles of governments or the state in these processes? I know these are big questions. And again, I'm not aiming to answer all these questions, but hopefully my presentation and the book will help address some of these issues, and hopefully they will inspire some thoughts for future researchers and theorists. Let me make a couple of clarifications. First, when I talk about collective problem solving, I'm not talking about everybody agreeing on something and working in unison to marching toward a perfect future all together. That's not what collective action or collective problem solving is about. As we know, human history is very messy. There's cooperation and work together, but there are also wars and conflicts and so forth. I don't need to mention these to you. But somehow, some way, humans manage to solve their problems collectively, at least partially, at least dealt with them. That is what I'm interested in. How did it happen, and how does it happen now, and how can it happen maybe in a better way? Also, I want to clarify this. I'm proposing this complex governance network, CGN, I will call it briefly, not as a theory, not even a framework, but as a conceptualization. It's not a theory in the specific sense of the term theory. I would like to make it a framework, but it's not there yet. So I call it a conceptualization. So let's talk about background of human collective problem solving in history. First, what were the organizational forms, institutional relationships that helped human beings solve their collective problems in different parts of the world in different periods in history? Well, we don't know all the answers. There's a lot we don't know, but there are a few things that we do know. First, for example, we know that humans are social animals. Therefore, they have the ability to act together and organize in a variety of ways. And in fact, they found very creative ways of organizing to solve their problems. So these are the things that we do know. And I want to highlight here in the beginning a book that I read recently. Actually, I was reading this book as I was writing mine, and I used some really interesting piece of information from this book. That is The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity by David Graeber and David Wengrow. They talk about this more recent archaeological and anthropological evidence that came out in the last few decades that tell us a lot more and interesting stories about human history. And I will touch upon some of them here. In fact, I will talk about 3 instances of collective problem solving in human history. And the earliest one is Göbekli Tepe. Some of you may have heard of it, and some of you may be even fascinated about it. I mean, this has created its own cottage industry of mythologizing and fiction writing and all the rest and so forth. But it is indeed interesting. Göbekli Tepe is the earliest known temporary gathering place of humans. It's a kind of ritual site, a temple. We don't know exactly what it is, but there are a few things that we do know. First, it's located in southeastern Turkey, today's Turkey. And it was discovered by this German archaeologist, Klaus Schmidt, in the early 1990s. And it shook up the archaeological sciences in a major way for good reasons. Well, first they found these T-shaped megaliths arranged in circular and rectangular forms. Now, you may have seen these pictures. These forms, actually, on these megaliths, there are some reliefs, some images of some wild animals and other things. So what is the significance of this? Well, these actually, all these megaliths and the images and so forth look like quite images of or arrangements of quite advanced civilizations. But this was, Göbekli Tepe was created roughly around 9000 BC, 11,000 years ago. This was before the beginning of the Neolithic age, which is quite important. And I want to address that. But let me back up a little bit. First of all, I consider this as the oldest known example of solving a collective problem. This collective problem was building a temple or a ritual place or whatever it is. It's kind of a public works project. And it was done 11,000 years ago. And it was actually before, several millennia before, even the ancient Egyptian pyramids, which was 2000 to 2500 BC, roughly, the oldest one. And this was also older than the first known human city, which is Uruk, and its ziggurats and other contributions to human civilization. I'll come to that. Göbekli Tepe came before Neolithic, or the so-called Neolithic Revolution. Why is that important? Because Neolithic Revolution is considered, at least assumed, to be the beginning of the agriculture. And that led to the accumulation of wealth. And that led to human settlements like cities, like Uruk. And that led to complex organizations, particularly bureaucracies, hierarchies, and all the forms of organizations that we are familiar with today. And it happened before all these. And that is what is confusing and quite fascinating. Now, what is it? We can go into the depths of all these, the significance of Göbekli Tepe and so forth. But the question is, I think, the question is this. As Graeber and Van Gogh raised this issue, how come all these happened when human beings were supposedly in this pre-Neolithic age, when they didn't have the tools or they didn't have the knowledge to do any of these and organizational forms and so forth. They were hunters and gatherers. How did they do it? Somehow they organized it. We don't know the answers to that, but I will leave it there. It is kind of an opening for the questioning of our history. The second instance that I want to talk about is the first city of Uruk, which came around again 4000, 3000 BC. This is first known city in human history. It came 6,000 years after Göbekli Tepe, and that's also an important marker. It's located in southern Iraq, and it's known for its ziggurats. This is White Temple particularly, and it's also known for its tablets, where the first examples of written language is found. And here's an example. So this is what we assume where civilization began. Writing, organizations, knowledge to create these monumental structures and so forth. And yet, Göbekli Tepe happened 6,000 years before this. Again, the significance of Uruk is that it's the first known city, and cities are known to be the first complex organizational forms. That is where the central hierarchical social relations emerged, and presumably the state or government emerged in cities as well. Well, if you look into the history of cities and archaeological evidence, what we think we know about these cities is a little bit more complex. It is correct, but not exactly. Here are some books about cities which I read in the recent years, and I found all of them fascinating, and they tell us about these complex histories of cities. And together with Graeber and Wengro's recent book, I think they give us a very interesting picture of cities and how human beings organize in them to solve their collective problems. One important thing is that cities are complex, but they are not necessarily hierarchically ordered. There are, in fact, non-hierarchical organizations of various forms, self-organization, self-governance, and combinations of hierarchies and non-hierarchical forms in these cities. And again, there are all these details in the book by Graeber and Wengro. Now, fast forward 6,000 years from roughly 6,000 years from this city of Uruk. So you can see that Göbekli Tepe, 6,000 years after that came Uruk, and then now 6,000 years after that, roughly again, more or less, give or take. Now I want to talk about recycling in the city of Ottawa, where I live now. Well, I have not studied the recycling, but I observed a few things. And I looked at the website of the city and others and so forth, and I gathered this, this sketchy picture of recycling system in the city of Ottawa. So there are different issues. First of all, pre-collection, collection, and processing issues. And the main thing in all this picture is there are multiple actors in this process that are not ordered hierarchically. This creates a complex system of recycling. And this is a problem that we are facing right now. I don't need to tell you why recycling is important, all the environmental problems and so on and so forth. So this is a significant problem. It's maybe a small scale in one city. And I looked into this problem a little bit more to understand its complexity. First thing that I noticed was that I asked this question, can we understand how effective this complex system is? The answer is yes. And for example, I found these recycled and not recycled percentages at the website of the city of Ottawa. And in this table, you will notice that I highlighted some items in blue, others in black. Why? Because, well, City of Ottawa instructs that the citizens place their certain items in blue bins, others in black bins. So this is pre-sorting. This involves some decisions by individuals and homeowners to sort them into bins so that they will be processed properly. Otherwise, they will waste it. I think that's a good effort. But you know that this takes a lot of work by many individuals, many organizations. Of course, the city itself. There is also a garbage collection company, I understand, WAM. There are business improvement areas that are involved in this. There are these homeowners, there are business owners, this and that, and all these interacting together to create this system. and we can gauge its success at various degrees by looking at these degrees. These are macro outcomes of a systemic work. The one thing that I noticed in this table was this: milk, drink, soup cartons. It has a low recycling rate. Why is that? I asked. Well, perhaps I thought some citizens like myself may be confused about this, because I think cartons are paper. Well, as it turns out, and I learned more about this, well, actually, it's not exactly correct, but who would know? There's a good reason to place them in the blue bins, but they could be misplaced in black bins, assuming that they are papers. Because if you look at the list, all the other paper products are supposed to go into the black bins. So I wonder if all these complex informational processes and people's perceptions and behavioral habits lead to this result, this macro outcome, low recycling rate. Do you think it could happen, really? I mean, people may misunderstand. Well, I took this picture on a street in Ottawa, close to where I live. I mean, look closely into this. What you will see is it is neatly labeled, and there are images that shows where should go where. Look what is inside. And this is, again, a real life picture. It's coming from one of the streets of Ottawa. So this confusion, I think, can create collective outcomes, collective results. By the way, this is not just the city of Ottawa. I want to clarify that I saw this confusion in a lot of other cities that I have visited so far. So all these are examples of collective problems and how human beings dealt with them in different periods of history. And of course, I know that this is a very sketchy overview, but I want to bring this discussion to the conceptualization that I'm proposing now. But you can see some clues of what I want to say in what I told you earlier in those examples, Quebec and Uruk and recycling in Ottawa. These are all systems, complex systems. So how do we understand these complex systems is the problem. And in my book, I looked at, first of all, the literature on this. And this is what I found. This is the Web of Science database. And when I use the keywords related to the CGN conceptualization, I found, as you can see, exponential increase in recent years. Beginning with 1990s, there is some growth to 2000s and 2010s, and you have exponential growth. So there is increasing interest in these governance issues, governance networks, complexity, complex systems, and so forth. But you might argue, well, you know, these issues are actually American issues, American concepts. Well, I did another search. This is ProQuest, not the Web of Science. Look at the list of publications about, these are the countries in which these studies, governance networks, complex studies, and so forth, they were conducted. Well, if you, at the top of the list, there's US, and then UK, Canada. Okay, so this is a European, North American thing, right? How about China? I wouldn't characterize China as a European country or a North American country or anything of that nature. So there seems to be interest in these issues in a variety of countries around the world, and there must be a good reason for that. Well, in the book, I present this conceptualization, CGN conceptualization. First, I talk about governance, and then I talk about networks, and then I talk about complexity. The reason I chose this particular sequence is because there is a rough evolution of these concepts in the literature that I observed. If you look at this chart, essentially what I observed, particularly looking at from the perspective of public administration, public policy literatures, is this. First came governance studies in 1990s, and then came networks, governance networks, and then complexity studies joined them, which essentially in the end created this complex governance networks or constitute the basis for this conceptualization of complex governance networks. It's not exactly in this neat order, but there is a pattern. And actually, I will show you some social network analysis that I did. And they show you actually, they show this particular pattern or similar, or they confirm this pattern, I should say, in general terms. So let's talk about governance. What are these people talking about governance? They say, or the authors, the theorists say, or the observers say, governance is different from governments. It includes governments, but it's a multi-centric, polycentric understanding of processes. And they talk about these diminished hierarchies, lateral relations as opposed to hierarchical relations, autonomous organization, self-organization, and they talk about implications for democracy and so forth. And they see these problems of coordination, effectiveness, accountability, some of which I discuss in my book. And here are some books that address these issues in recent decades. I want to focus on particularly Don Kettle's book. He makes really interesting observations, particularly relevant to public administration. He says that public administration is ill-equipped to deal with the problems of today's world. Because first of all, it was the vision of the progressives, which was centered around governments, I should say. And in this system, public services are delivered through hierarchical organizations, not in networks. At least that was not the way it was conceptualized. And there were these strict boundaries around public organizations. And there is this, of course, politics and administration dichotomy. And he says that this is inadequate and we need to figure out another way. And he makes a very good discussion in the book, by the way. There are many, many good details. Now, my question is, okay, all these are problems. Is there an alternative way to conceptualize public policy and administration processes? Yes, and in fact, there is some work on that too, which is the governance network conceptualizations. That is next. Let's talk about networks briefly. We are actually already familiar with networks. We are on a network right now in this webinar. And there are very well-known networks, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and the internet itself is a network. And there's a growing science of networks whose goal is to understand the structures of these networks mathematically. And in fact, there's a very interesting story of that. If you're interested, I talk about it in the book. It goes back to 1763, where there was this mathematician tried to solve the problem of bridge problem in the city of Königsberg at the time, which is essentially Kaliningrad today. And that story is told in this book, Watts-Strogat's Barbasi book. And there has been some work since 1930s on social network analyses, which are mathematical techniques, but they have basis in sociology and so forth, which we don't have the time to get into, but I'm sure many of you are already familiar with them. To make the long story short, there are some very good studies in public administration, public policy related literature on networks. Particularly, they are called governance networks or network governance. Here are three examples that I wanted to highlight. Well, so how does this network perspective help us understand governance processes? They help us understand the structure of networks, particularly the connections between and relationships among individuals and organizations. And the question is, if we understand these connections and links and so forth, can it help us understand these macro patterns, collective problems, systemic issues? The answer is yes. And there's quite a bit of good work, again, as I mentioned, those 3 books, but I also did this literature search in this Web of Science, which I found. I used social network analysis for these charts. This is 1990s. You can see some different groupings of in the literature. This is 2000s. You can see that they are coming together. And this is 2010s. The literature seemed to be converging. So we can, using these techniques of social network analysis, we can see the patterns, emerging patterns in the literature. These patterns are macro patterns, and these are based on these individual articles, journal articles that I found in the literature. There are some other examples too. In the book, I talk about this. For example, in an Israeli study, they found that those people who get their vaccine information from their family members and mainstream media, they are more likely to get vaccinated, whereas those who get their information from social media, they are less likely to get vaccinated. These are network connections, if you think about that, where you get your information from. It leads to some macro problems or macro outcomes. So that's the network issue. Those are network issues. Now there's this complexity. I think everybody understands that these governance networks are complex. They are complex systems. And there's a whole bunch of books about them. Complex systems in public administration and public policy came out in recent decades. And I try to contribute to that with my 2012 book, The Complexity Theory for Public Policy. In that book, I talked about these complex concepts of complexity theory, methodological tools of complexity theory. Now, in this forthcoming book, I apply these tools and concepts, some of them, and I use them with examples from COVID-19 pandemic particularly, and some metropolitan governance problems, including business improvement districts, business improvement areas. Here are some examples. One of the concepts of complexity theory is co-evolution. And I found this fascinating information about how viruses and human societies co-evolved. If you think about that, viruses existed for hundreds of millions of years. And they interacted with human beings for hundreds of thousands of years. But the pandemics happened only in the last 2 millennia, as far as we know. Well, that is because that is when human societies began to connect with each other in a more intense way. And Kyle Harper tells this story in detail. And he particularly talks about the Roman Empire and its extension and its transportation networks and social organization, political organization, how it facilitated this, the emergence of pandemics in human societies. So biological systems of viruses and social systems of human beings, they co-evolved over time. Just to give you another idea about this co-evolution issue, now we are familiar with these variants, right? Variants of COVID-19, alpha, beta, delta, now Omicron and subvariants and so forth. We know that they evolve within a human being and they are transmitted through our interactions. So the way we interact with each other, and whether we wear masks or not, for example, whether we get vaccinated or not, they all determine how the virus evolves. So, and then of course, we are learning and evolving ourselves too. In the last 2 years, actually, we learned a lot, changed our behaviors, and we are changing them again. Again, this masking issue is a big controversy in the US at this point, as you know. So anyway, these are there is coevolution in the case of viruses. There is also self-organization, which is another concept in complexity theory. Here's a problem. Can people self-organize during a pandemic? This is another way of asking, why don't we let people decide whether they wear a mask or not? Why don't we let people decide whether they get vaccinated or not? See, this is a big discussion. We all know that. In the United States, in Canada, in most other countries now, this is a big discussion. That's an issue with self-organization, self-determination, self-governance, and so forth. So why not? Well, actually, yes, people can self-organize, but I refer particularly to Ellen Rostrom's conceptualization of self-organization. She shows that self-organization can happen under certain conditions. And self-organization doesn't mean that we can do whatever we want and everybody can self-organize, everything will be all right. So understanding those conditions under which self-organization can happen is very important. One of the key issues is information. If people have the correct information, they have the correct beliefs and perceptions also, then they have more capability of self-organization and making good decisions about themselves and others. But we know that it doesn't happen. It didn't happen. There's lots of misinformation, disinformation, which required essentially for hierarchical organizations like governments to impose some mandates. Here's another example, non-linearity. Anti-vaccine influencers. There is some literature on that. There are these 12 individuals who are influencers in the social media who affected this anti-vaccine behavior, disinformation and misinformation disproportionately. Actually, they are responsible for 65% of the anti-vaccine contents, some analyses show. This is an example of actually one of the issues or one of the aspects of large networks, complex networks. It's called the scale-free power law distribution. In the power law, this is an image of it. There are few nodes, few individuals can attract more attention, disproportionately more attention than a large number of individuals, each of which attracts smaller influence or interest. And this is a pattern that is observed in complex systems by many, many researchers. So essentially, in this COVID anti-vaccine movement or phenomenon, if you will, that we observe this power law distribution. There are few 12 individuals who influenced a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And well, that's the way it is. Actually, we need to understand that. And by the way, we also, of course, the social media amplify these effects tremendously. We know that. So we need understanding these factors can help us address these collective problems. Now, the rest of the presentation, I'll be brief. By the way, this governance, networks, and complexity, these concepts I talk about in part 1 of the book. And in part 2 of the book, I talk about the micro-macro problem, which is actually the backbone of the conceptual framework that I'm proposing, the CGN conceptualization. But I'm not going to talk about them because we have very limited time. But the questions I'm trying to answer are very abstract, I know. But how do the properties of micro units like individuals affect macro structures? In other words, for example, people's intelligence, people's level of information, people's perceptions, how do they affect these macro level outcomes? Again, think about the misinformation, disinformation issues in the COVID-19 case, in the COVID-19 vaccination process case. Obviously, these individuals have all these various kinds of information, perceptions, capabilities, and attention span, and so forth. And that is the reality. That is the reality at the micro level. And the question then is, how do these micro level realities affect the macro structures, which is what happens at the pandemic level? For example, how do they affect the outcome that almost 1 million people died in the United States and almost 6 million people died around the world because of this pandemic? Understanding these micro issues can help us understand macro structures and their connections as well. There's a whole bunch of other questions there too, but again, in the interest of time, I will not deal with them today. And in the part 3 of the book, I talk about the implications of complex governance networks for 3 important issues. 1, effectiveness. Effectiveness, of course, is an important problem in public administration, public policy. We deal with it in a variety of ways. What does the understanding of complex systems, governance networks, tell us about this? I begin the discussion with the discussion of wicked problems, which is, I know, very commonly used and, in fact, in my view, misused concept. And I criticize it, and then I turn this into a discussion of effectiveness in that chapter 9. In the following chapter, I talk about accountability issues. Again, accountability is a very important issue in public administration. But the problem, the issue is, in complex systems, accountability becomes very complex. And I talk about all these issues. There is some very good work on these by others, and I try to combine them together and talk about them in a larger context. And in another chapter, I talk about democracy. What does complex governance systems mean for democracy? If there are any questions, I would love to address those questions, but very briefly, I can say that governance networks, complex governance networks, are challenging our notions of liberal democracy, because they challenge the basic definitions of, for example, sovereignty, jurisdiction, and hierarchical ordering of governance. So there are several implications of that. Now, conclusions at the end. First, what I draw these conclusions from what I've learned from all this literature and my studies. First, I think in public administration, policy studies, we need to ask really big questions. I mean, really big questions. Like, for example, how did human beings solve their problems 11,000 years ago in Quebec? It may have some implications for our understanding of 21st century. So that is why I asked all these questions about Quebec and Uruk and recycling problems and pandemics and climate crisis and so forth. There may be some patterns in that. We need to ask these questions. Another point, when I say complexity, of course, everybody is familiar with that concept, and we think that, yes, life is complex and all that, sure. But here's what I want to emphasize, here's something that I want to emphasize. Complexity doesn't mean perplexity. Complexity, yes, it is confusing, it can be confusing, but that does not necessarily mean that we cannot understand, we cannot study these things. What complexity theorists and complex networks researchers are showing us that there are newer, more sophisticated tools that can help us understand these processes better. And of course, as you know, there's this AI, artificial intelligence, that is coming up, which can help us do a better job, I think. And another point, with all these, I think, bring us to this, I think, at least my realization that we need to understand governance processes in a truly interdisciplinary manner. We talk about that, yes, but what I mean is, well, if we are talking about public administration, public policy, we are talking about politics, obviously, but we are talking about sociology, economics, biology, mathematics, and so forth. And the CGN conceptualization captures not all of them, but many of them. So those are my conclusions. And this is the end of my presentation. I hope I have not exceeded my time too much. Thank you, and I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Göktürk, for this interesting and well-documented presentation, I must say. I would like to invite the participants now to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send your questions, and I will come back to the questions in about a minute. But before we jump to the questions, I would like to invite all the participants to stay in touch with the Center on Governance. You can subscribe to our newsletter. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or on our YouTube channel. And this presentation will be found on our YouTube channels in a few weeks. So, Göktürk, we have some reactions. There's Muhitin Akar, Dr. Muhitin Akar, who's saying, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And while we wait for more questions, Göktürk, I'd like to go back to one of the topics you addressed in your presentation. And as a governance specialist, I see lots of similitude between the network theories and the complexity framework you presented. Actually, you merged them, and obviously there's a lot of interactions between both. I'm more familiar with the network theories, I must say, and it seems to me that you try to integrate both. But when can we separate both? Actually, network theories has some element of complexity, obviously. And when are we dealing with the network theories without the complexity? And what difference do you make between the two concepts? And what is the value added to use to integrate the complexity framework to the network theory? Because, you know, our world is now very complex and there's maybe a need for integrating both, but sometimes can we use them separately? So this is my question to kick off our conversation.
Sure. Well, thank you for this great question. Actually, this is a question I think I tried to answer in my previous book, 2012 book. And I looked at particularly the methods of network theories, which is social network analysis and various forms. And I also looked at complexity theory and its methods, which are essentially agent-based simulations and varieties of forms. And my argument was, and I still think that is the way it is this. Social network analyses are wonderful, and I use them, and I showed an illustration of that, but they are static. That is, in other words, you try to understand the connections, links between different nodes, different actors, different organizations, and so forth. For example, how does the city of Ottawa connect to the business improvement areas and the citizens, and what are the methods of connections and so forth? We can lay it out and map it in a network fashion. I could have done that. Unfortunately, I didn't have time for this, but or I did not have enough information about that. So I gave you a very sketchy picture. So in network analyses, we can take a picture of a moment, what is going on at that time, which is good. But in complexity agent-based simulations, we can simulate the relationships in a dynamic manner. And originally, at least, these agent-based simulations started with abstractions. Now, and that is the difference. In social network analysis, there are these real individuals that you can measure, you can ask them, you can send them surveys or find their information and so forth and find the connections. These are real individuals, organizations. In agent-based simulations, these are abstractions, or they were. Now, fortunately, I think there are many good scholars who are combining them, which enables me and others to talk about the story of complex governance networks. So we can combine social network analyses and agent-based simulations together in dynamic simulations, which are based on real life data. I think that is a strength. And there are some examples of that in the COVID-19 case, which I talk about in the book. I didn't have the time to cover them today, but it can be done. It has been done. And I think it's an important advancement. Again, going back to your question, are there differences? Yes, but I think there shouldn't be. That's my point. In other words, we are better off if we combine these methodologies to understand our complex systems.
All right, thank you so much, Göktuğ. I got our colleague Howard Greenwald, who's asking this question: will people be better off if government were simplified? And is this possible, instead of complexity simplification? I like the question. Thank you, Howard. Göktuğ?
Yes, I think that's a great question. And that is one of the issues in our complex systems anyway. That is this. I think the human minds, our minds evolved in such a way that we tend to, and we like to simplify anyway. So for example, even when we look at governments, we tend to think that they are hierarchies and there are certain orders, all those organizational charts, something is connected to something else and so forth. These are simplifications, and actually we love those simplifications. They help us understand things or make sense of things. That is the way our minds work. Why? I mean, how did this evolution happen? That's a long story, but that's the way our minds work. So with that understanding, would we be better off? Well, actually, yes, in a way, yes, because otherwise, if everything were too complex, it would be confusing to us. So that is why simplifications are helpful to us. For example, how could the city of Ottawa simplify the information about blue bins versus black bins? And maybe there is some other systemic intervention that would be better to simplify those things. Yes, so the answer is yes, given the fact that our minds work with simplifications. But here's the danger. If you oversimplify, and we tend to do that, many of us do, then we will fail to understand what's going on around us. And particularly in today's world, which is complex by its very nature. And we created this complexity. We contributed to the creation of this complexity. If we fail to understand that complexity, then no, we will not be better off. So my answer is yes and no.
All right, Göktuğ, and I see lots of questions coming in, so I'll ask you to keep your answer really short because I want to address most of them and we want to finish at around 1 o'clock. So my colleague Habibur Rahman is asking, global network governance has been particularly helpful in global environmental policy. That's true, like climate change, for instance. Why global networks has not been so impactful in tackling global poverty, global health, and so on? This is the question.
Yeah, great question. Of course, we can talk about this maybe for hours, and I'm not an expert in global governance, but very briefly, what I can say is just go back to what I said earlier in my presentation. When I say collective problem solving, I don't mean that we solve a problem, it dissolves or it disappears. We make progress. Somehow we adapt. So in that sense, the question I think should be, how successful have these global governance structures have been in solving some of the problems that we are addressing? For example, have we been successful in addressing the climate crisis? I wouldn't say that we are completely in a disastrous situation. No, because we have made some progress. Even the most recent gathering of politicians and scientists and so forth, was it in Glasgow, I think, it was some progress. It was not necessarily a solution in the sense that the problem disappeared. And I don't think it will. But yes, we can make some progress.
Thank you, Göktuğ. My colleague Anne Mevlek is asking, thanks for the presentation, ambitious food for thought. I have rather a question of detail. You said that wicked problems are often not well understood or used Could you explain what you meant? In my mind, wicked problems could be good starting point to grab complexity.
A great question. And I did, in the book, I talk about this in more detail, and then I did a quick literature search on that. Actually, there's a growing interest in wicked problems. But when you look at the literature itself, what you see, and others observe this too, by the way, it's not just me, but there are other authors who observe that, and I mentioned in the book. The concept of wicked problems becomes a kind of epithet. It is not a real definition of what is going on. And it is kind of a negative attitude toward our complexity. That is the way it's addressed. And there is no clear definition or common definition of wicked problems anywhere in the literature anyway. It is like, okay, these are all wicked that we don't know, and there are all these conflicting issues and so forth. People are confused, people don't know what they are doing, that is why it is wicked. It is unsolvable. And I think that is the issue that I'm having problems with. Wicked problems, the notion of wicked problems suggests that problems are unsolvable. Complexity theory shows that they are solvable, not necessarily in the sense that they will disappear, but in the sense that we can understand them and make progress. So that is my issue with wicked problems.
Thank you. Joe Farragon is asking, thank you for a most interesting talk. His question, how would you be thinking, how would your thinking be used to examine the national security issues, given that many elements are hidden behind secrecy or simply unknown?
Excellent question. And I'm not an expert in that area. But what I can say is that lack of information is creating its own dynamics in these international security problems, which actually is contributing to increased complexity. Because I think, in coming from, again, a very general understanding of complex systems, not particularly national security issues, coming from that perspective, what I can say is that secrecy, lack of information, is a source of compounded complexity, more complex than it is necessary. And in fact, there are some colleagues who did a real good studies on that. For example, the Dutch colleagues Klein and Koppenian, in their book and in their articles also, they talk about this strategic complexity. That is, yes, the world is complex. Yes, our organizations are complex by their very nature, but we can make them even more complex, unnecessarily complex strategically. That is, by using some information, not using some information, holding back information, or manipulating information. So that's my take on that.
Thank you, Goktuk. I'll take a few questions from some of our PhD students. Some of them you already met at the university. Chris Bouchard, who's doing a dissertation on cities, actually. She's saying, hi, Prof. Morkel, historically, cities have been convergence points, meeting points for people to live, pray, develop culture, and engage in commercial activities. It is my suspicion that market activities have been a key historical factor in the growth of complex relationships between people, organizations, and states. What do you think? Is the analysis of markets important to the emerging social network science?
Well, thank you, Chris, and a wonderful question. I hope we'll get a chance to talk about it maybe in person, because I cannot address all these issues very briefly. But what I can say is, yes, first of all, yes, markets are obviously important. But I think one of the things that complexity researchers, theorists are showing us is that what we call markets versus governments, for example, is not a very good conceptualization to begin with, because it has always been a mixture of both. In other words, yes, there are these economic transactions which create some complex system, that is true, but there's also these power structures, right, which is associated with governments. And that they together work to create the immensely complex systems in urban areas, in cities. So my brief answer is this. You're right, absolutely right, that cities are convergent points or medium, whatever we may want to call them. And they are fascinating examples of complex social organizations. So I'm as fascinated as you are about cities. I must emphasize that. But in terms of our understanding, I would say markets create complexity, yes, but not alone. They, together with governmental structures, they contribute to the complexity. And we can talk about this more.
Of course, you can. You have many other opportunities to meet Chris in person and discuss this interesting questions. Is sending you a thank you. Two last questions. Let's go really quickly with the questions and answer. Dr. Muhitin Akkar, who was presenting his regards a little bit earlier, is asking, what could you say about the need for and the possibility of collaborative ethic in and through the CGN concept you presented? Collaborative ethics.
It's a very interesting question. Thank you, Muhitin. And I'm not an ethicist, and I'm not particularly familiar with the concept of collaborative ethics. But what I can say in general is this. Well, ethics is actually morality in a larger sense. These are human knowledge processes that have been very, very helpful in human history. And I think this is, again, part of the evolution of human cognition, human mind, because, and I think they're the products of essentially our tendency to simplify. We need some principles to latch onto, to guide our lives. We need some simplifications to show us some way in life. And that's essentially what morality is about. And they have been useful. In terms of collaborative ethics, again, I'm not familiar with it, but it sounds like that, yes, if we can come up with real good principles of collaboration and codify them somehow in our collective understanding, if that is what the collaborative ethic means, yes, I think that's a good idea.
Lovely. And our last question is coming from Silvana Gomez, another of our wonderful PhD student. Thank you for this interesting presentation. We increasingly talk about the potential of data to better inform policymaking. However, your example of recycling in Ottawa shows that actors might not access, make sense of, and use information in a way that aligns with intended policy goals. How can complex governance networks help us address the mismatch between availability of data or information, collective action, and inefficient policy outcomes? Thank you for your question, Silvana. This is the last question for our presentation today. Goktuk.
Well, thank you. I mean, again, this is another great question. What I can say is this. Yes, indeed, information is not an independent thing. Information is, first of all, produced by someone with certain intentions, certain perceptions, and so forth. Say, for example, the city of Ottawa produced that information of blue bins versus black bins with certain intentions and some goals. But then it is also perceived, received by others. And the receiving end, the person or the organizations and entities at the receiving end are also very important. Their perceptions is very important. For example, again, take the example of masking mandates or vaccine mandates. One person, or the government or the CDC in the United States, for example, can create this advice with the intention of preventing the spread of the virus. But then there are many people we know, millions of them, perceive this as an infringement on their freedom. And in fact, we observed that in Ottawa too, right? When I came here in February, there was this so-called freedom convoy, truckers convoy occupied the streets of Ottawa, and I live very close to that, by the way. I had a first-hand information about observation of that. So their perception was completely different. So information itself is a very, very complex issue. So what can CGN help us understand this? Well, CGN by itself is not an answer. It is a way of looking at these things. First of all, appreciating, understanding that people have different perspectives. Now, given that, given people perceive masking mandates, vaccine mandates, recycling rules differently, how do we deal with this problem? I think the short answer is, let's not assume that people understand what you mean directly. So it is a complex process. Appreciation of that complex process, I think, will help us give the first step in understanding them, possibly making some progress in them.
Well, Göktuğ, this is all the time we have. I want to thank you really very much for your presentation and for this very interesting conversation on the subject. We'll follow your publication, your upcoming books on the subject. This is great. I hope we have other opportunity to discuss this topic and maybe some other topics, some of your research you're conducting right now in Ottawa while you're with us at the University of Ottawa. I would like to thank all our participants for today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your questions. And on that note, I wish you a great day. I'm looking forward to see you again very soon in another webinar or in-person activity with the Center on Governance. See you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.